All right, the meeting's recording now, so we can get started. Let me know if you can't hear me. All right, so I just wanted to remind you really quickly that our exam number 3 opens up after class tonight. So at about 6 p.m., your third exam will open up. So we've obviously not covered chapter 6 yet. We're going to be doing that today. Right now, it's about memory. So hopefully everything from the memory chapter will be fresh in your memory for the exam. If you don't feel like you're ready to take it tonight, that is all right. You are able to take it all through the weekend, all the way till Sunday. It will close just before midnight on Sunday. So make sure you take it at some point during that time. Again, it is open note, open book. I do recommend you make some kind of note card or like note sheet of things that you don't remember as you're studying. So that'll be a quick reference for you. I'm going to double check. I did look at it right before class. That there's an 80-minute time limit, but I don't remember now how many questions it is. So let me look at that really quick to remind myself how many questions, then I will let you know. And if we finish up with chapter 6 quickly enough today, we can even go over the study guide a little bit. All right, so it's 60 questions total, and you'll have 1 hour and 20 minutes to take the exam. So that lets you know a little bit more about the exam. Again, you can take it in between. I'll share my screen again. You can take that exam starting at 6 p.m. tonight, all the way through the weekend and the holiday break, and then it closes Sunday just before midnight. So just make sure that you take it before that time so that you can get full exam. Again, it is over chapters 6, 5, and 10, pretty much in that order. The questions kind of go chapter 10, chapter 5, chapter 6. So we'll cover chapter 6 right now, and let's get into that. All right, so chapter 6 is on memory. So we've got a lot to talk about of how memories are created, what's the use of memories, and essentially how can we make our memories better are some of the main points we're going to be talking about. So let's start with some definitions of some of the basic components of understanding memory. So encoding. Encoding is what we call the process of recording a memory. So getting that information into memory. So getting this discussion that we're having right now, our conversation, putting that into your memory, that process is called encoding. Attention, we've talked about attention before when we've talked about consciousness, so hopefully this is a little bit of a review, but attention is focusing your mental resources on things, and with that, it's going to improve your cognitive processing. So when you're attending to a conversation, you'll be able to understand it better, you'll get more of those sensations in, and then you can use your perceptions of those sensations to interact in the world. Similar with memory, if you're focused on something, it's going to be more likely that you're remembering it. So if there's something happening in your peripheral vision, that probably isn't going to get stuck into your mind, even if like the most important like math equation or a set of words or I don't know, whatever it is, it's like on your periphery, you've sensed that it's gone into your brain, but you probably won't put it into your memory unless you actually attend to it. So with that, attention and memory are tied to each other. So we've got things like selective attention, divided attention, sustained, and executive attention. We've talked about these in relation to consciousness. So selective attention is when you focus on specific relevant things. So you select what you're going to attend to. You listen to one voice in a noisy room. You have one conversation with one person and there's other conversations having around you. So that is selective attention. Divided attention is when you're trying to focus on more than one activity. So this student here is studying for the exam and their roommate is talking to them. So They're trying to converse with their roommate, or maybe it's a family member who's already there visiting for the break or something like that. So your family member wants to talk to you. You're trying to study for the exam. Your attention is divided. You're not going to be able to put all those things in your memory as well as if you were focusing on one of those tasks at a time. Sustained attention is when you're maintaining attention over a long period of time. So our class is essentially 3 hours long, so that's a pretty long time to sustain your attention. I know it is for me. Reading a whole chapter of our textbook all in one sitting, that would be a good example of sustained attention as well. We'll talk about why that might not be the best way to go about reading the chapter. If you want to put it into your memory, it's probably best to do it in a couple chunks. Executive attention is essentially our planning, our attention to goals, our monitoring our own progress. So this is my goal, is to get a good grade on the test. So I have a plan. I need to listen to the lecture today. I need to review my notes. I'm going to write a note page on things that I wasn't remembering when I was reviewing my notes. And then I'm going to go over the study guide. Anything that I didn't know on the study guide, I'll go over again in the notes or book, and then I will take the test. So as you make that plan and then you go off to do those steps, you'll monitor your progress. Let's say for some reason the Smart Book is failing. So that might be a novel or difficult circumstance. So you go, okay, well, I can't go back to the Smart Book now. How am I going to review executive memory? Or sorry, executive attention. So you could solve that problem and plan a new plan. Oh, I have to go and search on Wikipedia or something like that. So to complete the class paper, to study for an exam and do well, you need to use this kind of executive attention. A lot of our planned activities use executive attention. All right, so with that, here's a little comic from Calvin and Hobbes that I think is relevant. So in this comic, even though Calvin was in class, was sitting there, had the book open, appeared to be present in the class, he wasn't actually paying attention. He wasn't attending to the teacher's information. So if he had a test or had to know that material for the rest of his life, he's hoping the teacher didn't say anything important. So as we know from Calvin, probably did miss some critical things there. So let's talk about how we process things. So we attend to things. Now we have to process them and encode them, get them into memory. So let's talk about shallow, intermediate, and deep processing, because all of those are going to affect how you remember. So if you're doing deep processing, more likely you're going to remember things versus shallow processing. You're less likely to encode that into long-term memory. All right, so shallow attending or processing would be here on the slide. You might notice that there's shapes and letters of words. So you might see that there's letters. Oh, it's a slide. That's your shallow processing. This is a slide. It has words on it and it has a picture, it looks like. More an example of a intermediate level of processing of this specific slide is you give it a label. You recognize the words as words. Maybe you actually read the slides. You look and you say, oh, this picture is actually a diagram or a table talking about shallow, intermediate, and deep processing. You read the words. You say, give the stimulus a label, recognize a word as a word. So that would be an intermediate level of processing. So that's above that shallow processing where you say, oh, that's a slide, there's words, this might be relevant. Intermediate, you actually read it and you comprehend a little bit more, you're attending to it clearer, and you're processing it more. Versus deep processing is you think about the meaning of this slide. And that's essentially what we've been doing as we've been discussing these last couple slides, is I'm applying it to you actually experiencing it right now. How can you process this in a way that it actually does get into your memory? So thinking about the meaning of these words. So deep processing is this. We are doing deep processing right now. You're trying to make it meaningful, make it relevant to you, thinking about it in the context that there's an exam coming up. So I'm not trying to make anybody nervous about an exam. I'm using that as a relevant example to try and help it be more relevant to you, give you an example that's relevant to you. So hopefully that sticks in your memory. Hopefully at the same time, it's not also making you more anxious. All right, so elaboration is one other way we can process. Elaboration is when we form those connections around any kind of stimulus. So this could be the lecture for today, a new car you saw, a picture, something someone said to you. That can be the stimulus. And essentially, as you record or encode that memory, you use elaborations by forming connections. So for material in the class, you might think of real world examples. So think about a time you did study in a really deep processing way. If someone tells you something new that you didn't know before, you try to apply that to something you know. If someone teaches you something new about bears, I don't know, just as a random example, you try to apply that to what you already know about bears, memories you already have there. That is elaboration. You're elaborating on that content, you're connecting it to other relevant things. So it's essentially using more of your cognitive energy or attention on that specific fact, stimuli, event, whatever it is, to be able to process it more. And then hopefully the result would be it ends up in your memory a little better. So imagery is one thing humans do a lot of. So we visualize material that we want to remember. It's a really powerful encoding tool. With that, if you might have used imagery to remember, say, someone's name. I met someone who did a really great job with remembering like strangers' names that they were just meeting for a first time. They told me that anytime they learn someone's name, and we're in a conference setting, so they're learning lots of new people's names. Anytime they hear someone's name, they try to connect it to something meaningful about them that they can notice, even if it's just like their shirt color or their hair color or something like that. And then in their mind, they literally visualize that person's name like in three-dimensional letters that they can kind of like move around. They visualize that name in an image with like a relevant color or things around the letters that are specific to that person. And that is how they go about remembering people's names. So really good example. I've tried that tool. I'm just too slow at it. It's not a really useful tool for me specifically, but maybe it'll help one of you in the class. But visualizing, probably all of you do use visualizing when we're trying to tie things into memory. So imagery is something that a lot of world record holders use when they're trying to remember random letter sequences or words. So essentially what these records are written numbers in 1 minute. Essentially there's a random set of numbers written out in a list, and you've got to remember how many you can in 1 minute. And so this person, Gunther Karsten, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, might be pronouncing a lot of these wrong, remembered 102 numbers. That's the world record. 102 numbers in 1 minute. And I just cannot even imagine that. That's a good question. Why is Germany so good at these? Maybe their education system uses more memory techniques or teaches specific memory techniques explicitly. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm not actually sure. Also, a couple of these people, Simon and Johannes, they have multiple awards here. So I suspect also it's a bit of that someone who's really good at it will probably try to get multiple world records. If you can remember random words in an order, in a specific order, maybe you can also remember an entire deck of playing cards as well. Yeah, that's a really good question. I wonder if there is any specific thing in their education system that might make people from Germany better at these. Also, I wonder if these are still the current world record holders, because this was printed in your book. So yeah, a really good question. But the main point of these examples is that each of these individuals use imagery to remember these things. So to remember all these 102 numbers in 1 minute, Gunther remembers them in images. So maybe I would suspect probably chunks them into like meaningful images. So if part of a series of numbers was 911, it's easier to remember 911 as like connected to maybe an ambulance or a fire truck or something like that, and as a chunk of 911 together as one piece versus 911 as totally separate things. So there's multiple skills that they're probably using, but imagery is one of the main ones. So it's clearly very powerful. I cannot imagine memorizing 102 numbers in the correct sequence. Oh, there's a lot of static. Here, let me try something. This might make the microphone cut out entirely. All right, hopefully it's a little better now. So is it any better? Can you hear me? That'd be useful to know. If it's really bad, I could go as far as just completely ending the meeting, resetting my audio, and then restarting the meeting as well. It's funny, last time I did a class on this memory chapter, I also had computer problems. So I wonder if there's something about this set of slides. All right. There's still a static? Okay. I wonder if I have the microphone closer, or I'll check the settings really quick as well. Let's see if that helps. Oh, the static just stopped. Interesting. I wonder if there's some random interference. All right. Well, thank you for letting me know. Let me know if it comes back, because now I have the settings page up. So I can hopefully get things to work correctly. All right, so let's continue. So imagery is one way to encode more deeply, tying things to images, to relevant images in your own life. These are all really good ways to remember things better. So you might do a visual walk around random numbers to memorize a phone number. So, or tie it to something relevant. So an image of a person in a burger or something like that. So maybe this person's name, last name is Burger. If you use this image, you could probably remember this person's last name as Burger. With that, you could try to remember the digits of pi by turning them into relevant images. So you might say the number 3 is a chubby guy, and then there's a 1, and that's that person's cane. They walk to a takeout window, which is the number 4, because it kind of looks like a window, and then they order 15 hamburgers. So you can also use it that way. So using imagery. So giving the numbers or giving whatever you learn, it doesn't have to be numbers. It can be a fact in class, something someone just told you, someone's name, tying it to some kind of relevant image. So it works better for older children than younger. And the main reason for that is that older children essentially have been around longer and have more things to connect it to in their memory already. So we'll talk about kind of the development of memory, but that's the main piece is that older children have been around more years, they've seen more things, so there's more things for them to tie that memory to visually. So let's try one visual mnemonic. So mnemonics are essentially memory tricks to try and remember things, and there's a bunch. All right, my internet just died. Am I back?
I could hear you.
Okay, great. All right, so let's actually practice a mnemonic together. This is the method of loci or the journey method. It's actually one that I use pretty frequently. It can be used for things like remembering lists. It can be used for remembering really anything. I use it for like shopping lists or other random things that don't really have any relevant association. So let's try it with a list, kind of like you might a shopping list. So we'll go through, here's a picture of a floor plan in an apartment. So you would imagine yourself in a place that you know really well, probably your home or maybe a childhood home that you know really well. You know where things are in this place. It could even be a smaller location, a room specifically. It could be a bigger location, a park that you're really familiar with. The thing is, this location that you're trying to remember should be something that you remember really, really well and really, really easily. So I usually use the house I lived in when I was in high school. I just have a good memory of that place, and we'll talk about why at that age I might have a better memory of something there. So here we've got a front door. I can remember like walking in there. This isn't actually my house, but then like a living room, I can remember that. Bedrooms, closets, bathrooms, I can remember all these things, and that gives me something really easy to tie a new memory or a new thing to. So how I would do this is I've got this random list of words. So this might be a shopping list, for example, or a list of names. So what I would do is I would look at these words and I would come up with a visual story essentially for them. So the first word is bottle. So in my mind, I'm coming home from school, I see the front door, and there's a bottle on the ground. To make it even more relevant, it might be, say, a bottle of Mountain Dew, because in high school I drank a lot of Mountain Dew. And so there on the side of the front door is a bottle of Mountain Dew, and there's also a cup. Word two is cup, so a bottle and a cup. So I can remember those two in that order. I open the door, and then on the floor in front of the door is a pile of paper. Why is there a pile of paper there? I'm not sure. Or maybe in the living room, there's a pile of paper on, say, the coffee table or something like that. And then as I walk into the house, I notice on the ground, let's say in the hallway or in the living room, a bunch of sand. And so in my own mind, I think, oh, well, maybe my sister was playing in a sandbox, ran in and tracked sand all over. But now I can remember bottle, cup, paper, sand, and then I might see a box on the kitchen counter. Maybe it's an Amazon box or something like that with a package. And next to it on the kitchen counter, there's a fork. That makes a lot of sense to be in a kitchen. And then as I go through the kitchen, maybe there's a drawer with a stapler or a set of staples in it. So I can remember visually and walk through the house and see these objects in the different areas of the house. So try to do that yourself with this example. Try to think of a location, something that you know really well, whether it be a big location like a park or a hike that you often go on, a home, or a smaller location like a room as well. So your own room specifically. So something that you remember really easily that you don't have to work very hard to remember fine details of that location. And try to make some kind of visual image relevant to these words in that place. So practice it for just a minute, and then we're actually going to do this. I'm going to give you, I think, a minute and a half to remember a new list of 12 words using this mnemonic, the method of loci. All right, hopefully you've tried this for a couple of these words, like tried to make it fit them in your own location. Is there someone who is trying to use a completely different location than a house, maybe something like a room or a park, or even their house? And just tell us your thought process, what you're imagining, what you're visualizing for this list of words. You don't have to do all the words, but maybe the first couple. Someone be willing to just take over the mic and talk about how they were connecting these to something that they remember? Oh, there's a hand. All right, go for it, Kelly. Thank you.
Oh, I was just thinking about going to my desk. So I was like, oh, there's a bottle of water on my desk. I need to do some papers. I forgot there's some leftover boxes from moving in. I have to read my book for my class, and my desk is made from glass, and I have a lamp on that desk. On top of that desk, I also have a cup, and I also made a clay boat. So that's how I remember that.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's fantastic. Really good examples there, and very different than my like walking through a house example. So yeah, really good. And it really shows you could actually visualize, like I could visualize as you were saying that, Kelly, a desk that was glass with these different items on top. So perfect example. For the next list, try to remember them in order. So to do that, you might have to like organize them visually on your desk in a specific way. Yeah, really good example. Adam, I saw your hand up. Did you want to give your example as well?
Sure, why not? So I'm sitting at my desk right now in my room. I've got a bottle of water. Right behind it, I've got some cups that I need to take to the dishwasher. On my desk, I have a bajillion papers of notes. When I think of sand, I think of how kind of dusty my desk is. Probably need to clean it up. It's probably as far as I went with it.
No, that's perfect. Really good examples too. I liked how you took something relevant that you saw in your environment or could visualize maybe a little easier and associated it with the sand as well. So that's a good way to do that. Take it, essentially what you're doing with any of these is applying what the list is or what the new stimulus is, what the new memory, word, name, applying it to something that's already relevant to you. So the dust is a really good example of that. Thank you both for sharing that. I'm going to put up the next list of words, and then I'll be totally silent. What I want you to do is memorize those 12 words in the correct order using this mnemonic. So before I do that though, is there anyone still unclear about this method of loci, what you're supposed to be doing, how to use it? Either raise your hand or put up in the comments. So I can clear it up before we kind of, it's not for a grade, it's just like as an activity to see how many things you can remember using this method. All right, so I'll flip to the next slide. I'll start my timer and I'll give you a minute and a half to see if you can memorize all those 12 words in the correct order. And then we will test you, see how many you do remember and if it's in the correct order. So here it goes. I'll give you 2.5 minutes to learn, actually. Sorry. Go for it. About 30 seconds left. All right, that is 2.5 minutes. So let's see if you remember it. Take a piece of paper right now without looking at the slides, like on your own computer. Try just to use your memory and the mnemonic that you just used to try and remember all those words in that order. So write it down, take a minute. I'll give you, I don't know, 40 seconds or so. And then we'll see, I'll bring it up again and we'll see how many you got right. All right, so let's put up the list again. What I want you to do is count up how many you got in the correct order, and then just write in the check your list. Looks like my internet just died again for a moment. All right, I think I'm back. All right, sorry. My internet just suddenly went on the fritz, but I connected to my other network. It might be a little slower, but yeah, put how many you got right. All right, I've got a couple comments here. It looks like we should have 11 people in the meeting. So hopefully they're all actually here and not just turning on their meeting and then wandering away. But we do have a couple responses, so it looks like 10, 11, or 12. 9, 10, 11, or 12 for everyone. So sorry about my internet connection. I'm now on a slower network, but it should be extending to where I am as compared to where the router is. So hopefully there's no more drops, but hopefully it's also fast enough. All right, no problem. Karina, we just went over a mnemonic, and so when I put this recording up, probably tomorrow, go over and watch those first couple slides and learn what a mnemonic is, and then you can probably practice it on your own as well. All right, so let's continue on discussing. Good job with that. So 9, 10, 11, and 12 for everybody. So really good. That's a random list of 12 words. I mean, 2.5 minutes, that's a fair amount of time, but that's really good to remember all of those. I've done this in a lot of different classes as we practice mnemonics, and I tend to see that most people remember about 10, so it's a little above average is what we see here with so many people remembering all 12 of the words. So great work. All right, so one of the main things as well for learning and putting things into your memory, encoding it, is to understand things, especially when it comes to course content, understanding material rather than just memorizing it, because you can memorize this random list of 12 words, and for a shopping trip, that's totally fine. You just need to remember your list of items, get those items and come home. But if you want to really remember the things that we talk about in class and apply it to, say, your job or your life, understanding it is going to make it a lot easier to remember in your long-term memory. So making it meaningful, personalizing it, elaborating on it. When you learn about, say, disorders, if it's something that's relevant to you, you've known a person in your life, you might think about, oh, that's a symptom this person might have experienced. Oh, that might have been a struggle because of X, Y, and Z. So making that meaningful and understanding what it's connected to. Oh, that's an anxiety disorder. That's really relevant to times that maybe I've felt anxiety or things like that. Or applying what we're learning about memory today, a lot of it is relevant to what we've learned about neurology in the past. So that can be a good connection too. So how do we store our memories? So it's really important for our cognitive processes and cognitive development to have memories stored. So we see here an image from Inside Out, a little memory ball in Inside Out. Our memories aren't actually very much like this. I mean, for one, it's a fictional movie of little emotion creatures living in your brain. But our memory isn't recorded as film strips to rewind or go through. But we'll talk about that right now. So one of the types of memories we have is sensory memory. This is the information you're getting from your senses about the world around you. So the light information, so this goes back to our chapter on sensation and perception. So the light data going into your eyes, the sound data that you're getting through those mechanoreceptors in your ears, those hair cells. Then you've got taste, you've got touch. So all of your senses have a sensory memory. So essentially those nerves can keep firing with, say, the light image for a little bit longer than only seeing the light. So these kinds, depending on the senses, they last a little longer or shorter than other senses. But in general, all of your sensory memory only lasts a few instants to a few seconds. So a really good example of this is trying to draw a word with a sparkler. So if you have too long of a word, you won't be able to see the whole word, like literally see it. If you have a short word, like maybe love, or you're drawing a circle or something like that, your sensory memory is literally sending, or can literally send, that entire image of that whole circle at the same time. So that's what we're talking about, sensory memory here. It's the nerves themselves still firing that same signal, even if the sparkler is no longer up here, now it's over here or further along the path. So iconic memory is visual sensory memory. So it's essentially just the name for the visual sensory memory. So your sensory memory is holding, or really still just sending, that sensation of light data. So even though that light data is still not there, or is not there anymore with the sparkler, you're still sending that signal, or you still have a sensory memory of that signal being sent. This is related then to short-term memory. So short-term memory is information that we retain for up to about 30 seconds without trying to repeat it or work with it or elaborate on it and put it into long-term memory. So your sensory memory, you could imagine it kind of going into short-term memory. I'll talk about working memory as opposed to short-term memory in a second, but let's start here. So short-term memory is really limited in early childhood. So a 2-year-old might be able to remember, say, a 2-digit sequence versus a 7-year-old might be able to remember a 5-digit sequence. So you tell a 2-year-old the number sequence 27843, and the 2-year-old probably can't remember that whole sequence. If you tell the 7-year-old 278 see, now I don't even remember the sequence because I didn't make it meaningful for myself. It was too long. It had left my short-term memory. I didn't rehearse it. So as you can see, even adults' short-term memory has a limit. So with that, you take things from sensory memory, they can come into short-term memory, and then if you work with them, if you elaborate, if you use repetition, if you make it meaningful or connected to something, then you could put it into long-term memory. So with this, in early childhood, there's not a lot of short-term memory, and it grows up until about the teenage years, so about 14 or 15, where it's about at the point where it will be for the rest of your life. So short-term memory kind of peaks at that point and doesn't really diminish until you get to about 85, when it might, unless you have like a neurological problem, so, or something like dementia or something. So with that, we can remember essentially in between like 4 to 7 things at any given time in our short-term or working memory. So short-term memory is a passive kind of memory. You could think of it as the sensations that you're getting, the information that you're getting gets put up on shelves, and then it kind of despawns, it kind of disappears. So it appears and disappears based on your attention. So if you're attending to those numbers, a phone number someone, so if you meet a new person and you want to get their phone number, if you're not attending to that phone number, you might hear it, you might sense and even perceive, oh, they're telling me their phone number, but if you don't maybe repeat it, it'll disappear. So with that attention, or it appears that we have about that maximum of 7 spaces for information, and more recent research suggests maybe even fewer than that for people on average. So how do we improve that? That's not a lot of shelf space to remember everything that's going on at any given time. And that's true. We do have limited capacity for taking in information and putting it into our long-term memory. Even though our long-term memory seems that it probably has about infinite storage, it's hard to take everything right now happening and put all of that into long-term memory. So what do? We can chunk things together. I mentioned this earlier, chunking the number sequence 911. You can remember that as kind of one number. 911 is the number you call for emergency services here in the US. So you could associate it with something like an ambulance or a fire truck. So multiple numbers could be remembered as a group. So your area code, for example, on your phone number, you could remember that as one chunk. So that those 3 numbers now become essentially one chunk of information. And then the next 3 numbers, you remember that as another chunk of information. And the last 4, you remember that as another chunk. So essentially you're chunking these numbers or chunking the information that we've learned into different piles. And so this is something that you do actively with it in the process of trying to remember it at the time. So rehearsal is another very common option. We essentially just learn rehearsal, repeating information without ever being taught. Just realize that that's a good way to do it. So repeating someone's name over and over, repeating the phone number that person just gave us over and over to remember it. So let's talk about the more modern idea of the working memory. So you can use, I like to visualize the working memory being essentially the table that those emotions had in Inside Out. So they're at the table, they could call back long-term memories and like project them on their little screen. They had the new sensory information coming and they could think about it. Like, what do I do with this new information that I'm being presented with? That's essentially what the working memory is. It's kind of a mental workbench where you can take in your sensory memories, and you have these kind of short-term memory packets kind of being placed on this workbench. And so if you want to attend to this lecture as opposed to, say, the dog barking near you, both of those are kind of being set there on your mental workbench. And you have to choose, oh, I want to take this lecture one, or maybe you want to take the dog one. I mean, maybe if the dog looks like it's needing to go out, maybe that's what you've got to do right now. So you take that one and you can work with it. You can make it relevant. Oh, the dog looks like maybe it's going to throw up. I don't know, because it's making a noise that it's made before. So you're calling up long-term memories. Or here we're talking about memory and you're trying to remember the lecture. So you're writing things down in your notes. You're saying it to yourself. You're thinking of examples of when you've worked with new information that's come in. So with that, our working memory, you could kind of also think of our working memory as our consciousness. It's not exactly the same, but you could kind of think of it that way because it's essentially where we live. We live at our working memory bench where we're experiencing things, we're thinking about them, we're choosing what to attend to, and we're calling back long-term memories to apply to what's happening now. So essentially, we live where our working memory is, or that's where our consciousness is kind of lying, or where our consciousness lives. So the prefrontal cortex, you might imagine, is really heavily involved with this. There's a lot of choosing of what you're going to attend to, repeating, or you're going to use elaboration in different ways to remember it, and it is involved in all your aspects of life. So unless you're just kind of running on autopilot, like those basic functions we generally do, the habits you have, they might not take much working memory activity. It's kind of like your working memory has pushed that like autopilot button and you're just doing those basic functions. So those neural networks that are most commonly activated, they're still being the most commonly activated. So it improves, the working memory itself improves through adolescence into adulthood. So while our short-term memory kind of peaks in the adolescence and we don't remember additional chunks of things, we don't have additional spaces for our memory to put it onto this mental workbench, we can do a better job with our working memory. We can make it more efficient. We can learn new tools or skills or tricks like mnemonics to do better with taking things on this mental workbench, our working memory, into our long-term memory. So let's watch this video about working memory. It's pretty relevant to what we're talking about here. And hopefully with the speed of the connection, it'll be fast enough. It's essentially a TED Talk discussing working memory. And we'll learn a little more, some more examples. There's also a couple exercises that he goes through in this video. So do try those exercises as he asks you to try and remember things. I'll pause it to try and remind you as well.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay, we're not talking to each other, we're facing forward, we're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting, and he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pull some of that in as we need it. Mixes it, processes it, in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie. Or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Okay? Now, working memory capacity is our ability to leverage that. Our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride. You up for that? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words.
So do try to do this exercise. It's going to do 5 words. Use whatever method. You can use the mnemonic we just learned, repetition, whatever you want to do, imagery just generally to remember these 5 random words.
And I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down. Just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you were wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards. You should have started with Z. All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words?
So who thinks they've got all 5 words now? Anyone who thinks they've got all 5, list all 5 of them in the order he did in the chat box. Sorry about that. Hopefully some people could hear it. Might have been my problem with the audio, might have been the internet connection. It's a frustrating aspect of this broadcast kind of class. When it's a class where I'm recording a lecture for fully online, I can go back and like fix things or edit them if they're messed up. But good, it looks like a lot of us have it. So tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, electrode. Good. So I am interested also in what kind of method you used to remember these. For myself, I used imagery. So for imagery, I imagined a tree, just a random tree, and then he said highway. So then I imagined the tree was on the side of the highway as I'm driving by. Mirror, well, I look at my car mirror, and in the mirror, I can see Saturn. So now the background becomes like a kind of 80s album cover, and it's like all neon colors, and Saturn's there, and there's also an electrode. So that's how I remembered all 5, is just using imagery. So is there any other methods that people used, rehearsal and repetition, or did you try a mnemonic? Oh, Saturn as the type of car. Oh, and then electrode you just remembered. Yeah, I feel like electrode kind of isn't as related, at least in my imagery that I started with. So I imagine, but Saturn as the type of car is a really good idea there. Interesting. So yeah, a lot of us used imagery then to try and remember these. So it's a pretty useful tool that humans have evolved the capacity for. Yeah, let's continue watching this. But good job. It seems like anybody who heard it was able to remember all 5. So way to go.
Okay. Typically, we end up with about less than half. right? Which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down to 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Okay? And it's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome. Okay? Working memory allows us to investigate our current experience as we move forward. It allows us to make sense of the world around us. Okay? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that. So I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Okay? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. Okay, it used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving, all right? Now, we can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it. When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? Okay. You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay. All right. Have you ever forgotten your keys? You ever forgotten your car? You ever forgotten your kids? Okay. Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? All right? So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say. Okay? All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about a couple of strategies here. And these will be really important because you are now...
And these strategies that he goes over are some of the strategies we're going to be talking about today. So one, mnemonics, another repetition, making it meaningful. I've already mentioned quite a few of those. So feel free to watch the rest of this video later. But I mean, we kind of talk about most of the next points in class already. So yeah, our working memory is really important and really critical for a lot of our cognitive factors or faculties, like you mentioned. So it's essentially where our consciousness is living and we're experiencing, we're trying to remember things, use new information. So it's really important. And it is a capacity that does seem to not decrease unless you do have something like a neurological disorder. So working memory can also be improved through strategies, through working with it, through trying to learn new memory tricks. So it's a really useful cognitive capacity and really relevant to you in life. So we're going to talk specifically today about memory strategies for learning in school settings, but this applies for all kinds of settings of trying to use your memory. So good working memory is very highly correlated with good language ability, math skills, problem solving, and reasoning ability. All pretty good things, especially depending on what kind of... long-term memory is a different thing. It works differently, and how it works still is in some ways a mystery. So we'll talk about the neurology of it in a minute, but we'll move from working memory to long-term memory. So you can think of a long-term memory as if you know much about computers at all, you can think of long-term memory as your hard drive or your SSD. And you can think of working memory more like the RAM. So the processes that the computer is currently working with, that it's trying to do. So all the programs that are running right now, I'm running Microsoft Teams. YouTube's running in the background. Actually, I'll make sure. Okay, good. YouTube's closed, so it's not having to process that as well. But the working memory is kind of like the RAM on a computer, versus long-term memory is your hard drive or your SSD. So it's relatively permanent. Once things get into long-term memory, they tend to stay there. They can get manipulated or changed slightly to even largely, but we'll talk about those specific kinds of things in a minute. So long-term memory at its basics, relatively permanent. It's pretty large in capacity. It seems to be about infinite in what we can put into long-term memory. With that, though, you have the limitation of kind of a working memory bottleneck. So you have to use your working memory to then put things into long-term memory. And so anything that you're experiencing now, you've got to chunk it together or make it meaningful to then send it to long-term memory. And then once it's there, it's basically stored there all the time. And the quality of the memory is also dependent on the strategies you were using to remember it. So if you just tried to rehearse a number 2 times, you might remember it in your long-term memory for a while. You might even suddenly remember it like a year later, just randomly. But it's not going to be as high quality or as clear, or if we use the inside out example, that memory will kind of be faded and gray, as opposed to something that you really made meaningful. You were using a lot, you were using that memory a lot, so that would be a lot clearer and easier to remember. So the long-term memory capacity increases in middle and late childhood, and a lot of that goes back to experience. So early children, so infants and early children, they're still wiring up their brains, right? Up until about age 2, still new neurons are moving to where they need to be. And then dendrites and axon branches are stretching out, making connections during that whole time. Then we start pruning. So essentially during that whole time, up until middle and late childhood, the brains are figuring out how to remember things. So with that, the long-term memory probably also increases in capacity in adolescence, but that's a hard thing to test as well. So there's some evidence that suggests that it might still be increasing in capacity there. So here, this diagram essentially is talking about how the long-term memory and the working memory interact. So we have and you don't need to know all these details in a ton of detail, but the visual spatial sketchpad is essentially our mental imagery. The phonological loop is essentially your auditory sensory memory plus it going into your working memory, trying to tie those things. So you're seeing this slide, that'll be on your visual spatial sketchpad. You're hearing me mess up words, and that's in your phonological loop. And then with your working memory, you're using it as a central executive to say, okay, this is relevant, this is not. And then the episodic buffer is essentially like what's going on now, how much attention are you paying, what else is happening in the context that you're in, those kinds of things. And these are all interacting with each other and then able to tie things and send things down to the long-term memory. Your long-term memory can also pull up interesting or relevant visual images, or interesting or relevant sounds, or interesting or relevant things about a situation or context as you try and remember something in your working memory. So this is essentially a model of how these are working together. These are not necessarily tied to like one area of the brain does this versus one area of the brain does this versus one area of the brain does this. Obviously, the language processing area of the brain is pretty heavily involved in the phonological loop. And the cerebellum back here, where you process visual information, is pretty heavily involved, but they're not the only components of your brain involved in those processes. So with long-term memory, we have essentially 2 kinds of long-term memories, implicit and explicit. Implicit is the memories that you don't have a conscious recollection of making. Usually these are skills or things that you do, like using a spoon or using a fork, riding a bike, things that you might remember the first time you did learn to ride a bike, but you don't have to consciously remember, like, I pedal this way, I pedal my right and left foot, the brake is on this side. You kind of know how to do that now. That's an implicit memory. Versus an explicit memory is kind of like your what we generally think of as memories. So the kind of visual images, the experience, the emotions we were feeling, these are the conscious memories of facts or experiences. So that's an explicit memory. So if you remember a fact that the mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell, that's an example of an explicit memory. If you're remembering the time that Thanksgiving that you were at where your little brother ate all the pumpkin pies and everybody was mad because nobody else got pumpkin pies. That would be an example of an explicit memory. So it's generally what we're thinking of when we consider memories, but don't forget those implicit memories. They are important. So you probably remember the time, well, you might remember when you were learning to drive a car, but now the process of driving a car is implicit. You know, like where your shifter is, where the lights are, those kinds of things, where the windshield wipers are, even though it doesn't seem like in Utah you need to use the windshield wipers super often, except maybe to get the dust off of your car or the pollution. Anyway, most research does suggest that explicit memory doesn't really exist until about 1.5 years old. And then with that, as you grow older, it seems like this explicit memory length and duration of time expands. So for a 6-month-old, again, with the test here, we've talked about this in the developmental chapter. A lot of this work is done with the attention and eye tracking. So what are a 6-month-old child paying attention to? What are they looking at? So that's how you kind of get the number of, it seems that they can remember an explicit memory for about 24 hours versus at about 2 years old, we can start to form really clearly explicit memories. But a lot of us don't have memories that early. I certainly don't have any memories before about the age of 4. And that's about the average is about age of 3. So yeah, that's another point. So yeah, we'll get back to that point in a couple slides. So let's watch this video on how we process memories. And after that, we'll talk about it a little bit and then probably take a break after that and then come back and talk about the neurology of memories and how they're actually written into our neurons. So let's watch this on how we process memories. Some of this is review. It talks about working memory. It talks about like visuospatial sketchpad. So it's a little bit of a review, but it talks about other examples and goes over some things that we haven't covered in detail as well. So more repetition and more meaningful content to connect it to.
Clive Waring was playing the piano alone in his room. When his wife came into the room, he immediately leapt up and embraced her with joyful enthusiasm. A minute later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare...
Sorry, it's the video is completely paused there, so it's just sending that one image. I'm going to close some of my windows and see if that helps. Give my computer's RAM less to do. Give my computer's working memory a little less to have to keep in its working memory, and then hopefully it'll do a better job pulling this into working memory. If not, we'll just now and I'll reset my computer. Yeah, maybe we'll just do that. All right, let's take a break right now. I'll reset this. So with that, I'm probably going to leave the meeting and then come back to it. Hopefully that doesn't actually end the meeting. If so, I'll just restart a new meeting. But then hopefully it'll all work a little better after that. So let's take a couple minute break. Be back here at 3:47, and we will continue our discussion on memory. All right, and we are back. Uh, let's hope that this works better this time. Let's watch this again. It's a little bit of a review from what we've talked about on memory so far, but it also gives a couple. That's strange. Looks like my webcam is now not working. Is the webcam working now? It should be. All right. Either way, okay, good. It's working. Perfect. Thank you. So a little bit of a review, a couple new examples, and a few additional pieces about memory that we haven't covered yet.
When his wife came into the room, he immediately leapt up and embraced her with joyful enthusiasm. A minute later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare herpes encephalitis virus that ravaged his central nervous system. Since then, he's been unable to remember almost any of his past or to make new memories. His wife is the only person...
Oh, that was my fault. I thought I had it on share, but I guess I turned it off when my webcam went down. Sorry about that. Well, you heard the story. It's just a little visual example. Clive, well, I'll just restart it. It's fine. Thank you for letting me know. Sorry about that. Partially my error, partially technical difficulties. It's obviously about time for a break, right? A fall break or something. That's happening in the next few days.
A minute later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare herpes encephalitis virus that ravaged his central nervous system. Since then, he's been unable to remember almost any of his past or to make new memories. His wife is the only person he recognizes, but he can never recall the last time he saw her. This may be the most profound case of extreme and chronic amnesia ever recorded. Our memory helps make us who we are, whether recognizing loved ones, recalling past joys, or just remembering how to walk and talk and fry an egg. Memory is the chain that connects our past to our present. If it breaks, we're left untethered, incapable of leaving the present moment and unable to embrace the future. But memory isn't an all-or-nothing thing, of course. Waring can't remember any details about his personal past, but he still remembers how to speak English and get dressed and play the piano. Some memories you process automatically, and they are stored differently than your more personal or factual memories, like your first kiss, or how to recite pi to 12 places, or who won the Peloponnesian War. Speaking of ancient Greeks, and to help demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want you to have a look at our Spartan friend here and remember his name, because we're going to be testing your memory in just a minute. Technically, memory is learning that has persisted over time, information that has been stored and in many cases can be recalled. Except, of course, during the exam, our memories are typically accessed in 3 different ways: through recall, recognition, and relearning. And if you think about all the different kinds of tests you've taken in school, they're all actually designed to size up how you access stored information in these ways. Like, recall is how you reach back into your mind and bring up information just as you do in fill-in-the-blank tests. So if I say blank is the capital of Greece, your brain hopefully would just recall the answer as Athens. Recognition, meanwhile, is more like the multiple choice test. You only need to identify old information when presented with it, as in, which of the following was not an ancient city in Greece: Athens, Marathon, Pompeii, or Sparta. And relearning is sort of like refreshing or reinforcing old information. So when you study for a final exam, you relearn things you half forgot more easily than you did when you were first learning them, like, say, a basic timeline of the Greek Empire. But how? How does all of that data that we're exposed to all the time, every day, become memory? Well, in the late 1960s, American psychologists Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin figured out enough about the the process of memory formation to break it down into 3 stages. First, it's encoded into the brain, then stored for future use, and then eventually retrieved. Sounds simple, but by
So this is another example of a visual model talking about all these processes and how they're working together. So we've talked about this already, right? The sensory memory going into working memory, and that can go into long-term memory. This is just a visual example or model of how that happens. So again, this external event could be a new phone number or a new name or a list of numbers or a lecture, and then how we remember these things. So just to tie it into stuff before and hopefully make it stick more in your memory, because hopefully this is helping with that encoding process.
eventually retrieved. Sounds simple, but by now you've figured out that just because you take a lot of stuff about your mind for granted doesn't mean that it is not complicated. By Atkinson and Shiffrin's model, we first record things we want to remember as an immediate but fleeting sensory memory. Think back to the image I showed you a minute ago. You remember his name? If you do, it's because you successfully managed to shuffle it into your short-term memory, where you probably encoded it through rehearsal. This is how you briefly remember something like a password or phone number. Like, hey Tommy, what's Jenny's number? Okay, 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-53. You're getting it in your head there. Or in this case, I told you to remember that guy's name. Maybe you were thinking Leonidas repeatedly over and over, even if you didn't think you were doing it. But this information really only stays in your short-term memory for under 30 seconds without a lot of rehearsal. So if you weren't repeating Leonidas, you probably have forgotten it already. Because your mind, amazing as it is, can really only hold between 4 and 7 distinct bits of information at a time, at which point the memory either decays or it gets transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory is your brain's durable and ridiculously spacious storage unit holding all of your knowledge, skills, and experiences. Now, since the days of Atkinson and Shiffrin, psychologists have recognized that the classical definition of short-term memory didn't really capture all of the processes involved in the transfer of information to your long-term memory. I mean, it's more than being able to just remember some Greek guy's name. So later generations of psychologists revisited the whole idea of short-term memory and updated it to the more comprehensive concept of working memory. Working memory involves all the ways that we take short-term information and stash it in our long-term stores, and increasingly we think of it as involving both explicit and implicit processes. When we store information consciously and actively, that's an explicit process. We make the most of this aspect of working memory when we study, for instance, so that we can know that Athens is the capital of Greece and that Pompeii was a Roman town and not a Greek one. This is how we capture facts and knowledge that we think we're going to need. Like I told you, specifically to remember Leonidas's name, you concentrated on that detail and filed it away, if briefly. But of course, we're not conscious of every tiny thing that we take in, yet our working memory often transfers stuff we're not aware of to long-term storage. We call that an implicit process, the kind you don't have to actively concentrate on. A good example might be classically conditioned associations, like if you get all sweaty and nervous at the dentist because you had a root canal last year. You don't need to pull up that file on the last time you got your face drilled on to think, well, oral surgery, not my favorite. Instead, implicit processes cover all that stuff automatically. This kind of automatic processing is hard to shut off. Unless you got something unusual going on in your brain, you might not have much choice but to learn this way, like how you learned how to not put your hand into a fire. That learning would have happened pretty much automatically as soon as you first yanked your hand away from an open flame. What are those?
So we talked just last week about learning and behaviorism. So the classical as well as operant conditioning, that's, again, what he was talking about. He mentioned that classical conditioning really briefly, but hopefully I just want to remind you, basically this whole example is the entire chapter that we read last time, that a lot of conditioning ends up being an implicit memory rather than an explicit memory.
Those things are lodged in there explicitly or implicitly or both. There are also different kinds of long-term memory. For instance, procedural memory refers to how we remember to do things like riding a bike or reading. It's effortful to learn at first, but eventually you can do it without thinking about it. Long-term memory can also be episodic, tied to specific episodes of your life. Like, remember that time that Bernice fell out of her chair at chemistry and everybody started laughing uncontrollably? Man, good times. There are other types of long-term memory too, and we're continually learning more about the biology and psychology of the whole complex phenomenon. For instance, while Clive Waring's episodic memories, among others, seem to be deeply affected, his procedural memories for things seem to be in one piece. This has to do with neuroanatomy that we do not have time to explore here and that we don't yet fully understand. Waring and others have a lot to teach us about the different types of long-term memory storage. Now, for healthy memories, there are lots of little tricks you can use to help remember it.
So again, this is going to jump into some strategies and skills, which again, most of these we talk about, but feel free to watch the rest of this video on your own time. We're actually going to talk now a little bit more about the neurology that he said they don't have time to get into in this video. So let's get into it in this recording. So let's talk about how we actually store those memories, whether they're implicit, whether they're explicit, whether it's classical conditioning, operant conditioning. What is actually happening at the neural level is pretty fascinating. And like you said in the video, we don't fully understand as well. So let's talk about what we do know. So a reminder of the neuron structure and functions of parts of the neurons. So here we've got the cell body of a single neuron. Here we've got the nucleus, which has the genetic information, tells it how to grow, how to create and produce neurotransmitters, things like that. The dendrites that are receiving a message from nearby neurons, the axon, which sends the message to other neurons, and then the axon branches that can reach out and touch lots of other neurons, dendrites, or cell bodies. And then myelin sheath as well to insulate it, speed up the process. Synapse, that's where the transmission happens. The neurotransmitter is coming out of there, connecting to the next neuron. If that neuron gets excited enough, has enough of that neurotransmitter sent to it, it will then fire and activate. If the message is strong enough, it will send the message to the next one. So memories themselves, similar to our habits. So we've talked about this in the sense of habits are kind of a set of neurons that are just auto firing a lot of the time. Memories are specific sets or circuits of neurons working together to almost, not exactly, but almost make you experience that same thing again. So it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. So in humans, it's probably groups of about 1,000 neurons per memory. So your memory of learning to drive a car, the first time you drove a car, that's probably about 1,000 neurons. And some of those 1,000 neurons might be neurons currently part of the neural pathway to drive a car. So probably pretty likely, honestly. Any single neuron there can play multiple roles. So maybe a neuron, there's 200 neurons out of that 1,000 in your memory of learning to drive a car that are still in the process of you knowing how to say turn on your turn signal and check your blind spots to then move over. So any single neuron can be part of multiple memories. All right, so with that, single neurons can also kind of prime memories too, especially things that we've talked about before, like feature detectors. So humans have the capacity with sensation and perception to recognize faces really easily, to detect colors or shapes. So those kinds of feature detecting neurons can also be tied to specific kinds of memories. Let's say someone has a similar face to your favorite grandpa. That feature detectors that are detecting that face might be tied to certain memories for that favorite grandpa of yours, and it might bring up memories related to the grandpa because these are all part or connected to the same networks of neurons. So neurotransmitters are that chemical soup between the neurons and in the synapse that allow that synapse to communicate across. So we just mentioned that. These chemicals help in establishing those memories. So that signal being sent to the next neuron, and then while you're sleeping, that signal kind of being sent again, or repeating it in your brain, resends the signal, resends those neurotransmitters out to then strengthen the relationship or the association between This is neuron 543, and then the next one is 544. It strengthens that bond between them. The dendrite gets more energy or gets more branches to connect to that synapse. The synapse becomes more sensitive, becomes easier for the next neuron in the sequence to send a message. And essentially that's how we develop habits too, is these neurons that we are using to do whatever habit it is. Maybe it's that every time my coffee is brewing, I pull out my phone and I open a specific app. Generally, since it's early morning, it's like the my camera app to check on my kids. So like the little like nanny cam thing. So I check that, and that's just a habit. So the neurons for like sitting there next to the coffee pot as it's brewing, that's part of a network for this habit to do that. And that also, when I'm remembering this event, that same set of neurons is firing, because the neuron A is really closely connected or really well connected with neuron B. And so firing neuron A very easily fires neuron B, neuron C, neuron D in that system of 1,000 neurons for that memory. So how do we know this? How do we know that this is how humans remember things, through these networks of neurons? Well, it was hypothesized for a while, but we can actually watch some memories be created in animals like sea slugs. So a sea slug only has about 10,000 neurons total, which is quite a lot, obviously. But compared to humans who have 100 billion neurons, that's a lot more. So it's a lot easier to map every single neuron in this sea slug and know where each and every neuron is connected to, then watch the connections between them get strengthened or weakened and see the networks of memories, essentially. So that's what we know from the sea slug. So the sea slug just naturally, I think this back here is its gill, but let's just pretend, even if it's not, that is what it is. So it has a reflex, just a survival reflex, to retract its gill when it's poked. So just as a survival instinct, it has that instinct already. It's not something that needs to be learned. All sea slugs do it unless you do something like this. So scientists conditioned it using classical conditioning to not care about the poke. Maybe they used habituation, they poked it enough times and it realized it didn't have to retract it. Whatever method they used, they conditioned it to not care about being poked. So in that process, they could watch the neurons. They could see neuron A, is it sending a signal to B, C, D? They could watch the networks of the sea slug's neurons. And then, after it learned to not care about being poked, they would apply a shock to its tail when touching the gill. So now it didn't care if you're touching its back, touching its gill, but now they reconditioned it to learn to be really afraid of getting its gill touched. A little inhuman, obviously, to shock the creature, but it's an easy way to test behaviorism and learning, right? Is punishments. So they applied a shock to it when touching its gill, and so it relearned to be very afraid of that. So after that new conditioning, rather than just retracting the gill, it would do it really violently, even at a very light touch. So very much different behavior than natural behavior. So essentially they got rid of its natural instinct, then reinstalled, I guess you could say reinstalled, a new memory to be really afraid of getting its gill touched. And with that, they could watch the neural patterns. They could see with electrodes and things and mapping out the neural system of these sea slugs that certain neurons were getting stronger connections with others or diminishing connections at different times. So with that, they could see that this new memory of being essentially, they're not looking at emotions. So they don't know that the sea slug is afraid, but they can see this new memory, this new learned behavior lasts for hours or even weeks with the sea slug. So the gill itself as well releases a neurotransmitter, serotonin, at the synapses. And that essentially is the message that it's getting shocked. So they can see that same message for being touched as when it was getting shocked. The animal learned to send that new signal. It was connected. It was associated. And that then triggered the whole set of neurons in that network to do the whole learned behavior. So humans are really similar. We might, for this specific example, a traumatic trigger is a really easy connection to make right there. So if there's a song or a sound or a person or a word or whatever it is that's really triggering for someone's trauma, smell even. So if there's something really triggering for that person's trauma, it's essentially doing this. That sensation and perception can trigger that set of traumatic memory. So that whole set of around 1,000 neurons in that network being triggered by by the trigger. So very similar to the touch on the gill of the sea slug. So with that, the nice thing about the sea slug is being able to look at the connections between the neurons, look at the neurons strengthening their connections with other nearby neurons within those networks and losing those connections when they made it forget that instinctual behavior. So when any two neurons get activated at the same time, they might form a stronger connection. If it's happening repeatedly, like doing repetition or making it more meaningful, running over that same information again, it makes it a lot more likely that those two neurons will then fire together, or that A will then fire B, or A and B will then fire C. So those things make essentially well-established neural networks or patterns or highways where it's really easy or really fast to send that message. So our habits are made in about that same way, and so are memories. So kind of, not exactly, but kind of, when you're remembering something in a little bit of a way, you are again re-experiencing it. So let's use not a traumatic experience, well, hopefully not a traumatic experience, of a first kiss. So you might be able to remember your first kiss. With it, when you're remembering that, you might remember emotions you felt, what was happening around you, like where you were you in a park, a house, things like that. But as you run through that memory, that neural network, you are essentially activating some of the same neurons that were active during the experience. So let's say 5,000 neurons were active during the experience. So a 5,000 neuron network were active during the experience of your first kiss. The memory now is using about 1,000 of those neurons in a network for you to remember that one single event. If you remember your prom night or a car crash, actually a car crash is relevant to other memories that we'll talk about later. But these memories are in some ways using, and not always, but sometimes using the same networks of neurons that were active when that memory was being formed. So pretty neat. Questions on that? I mean, we've talked about neurology before. We've talked about how neurons talk with each other. We've talked about habits this way a little bit. So hopefully this is clear. Hopefully you've got the background information and you can see how the neurons are connecting into these networks. Another example, if you know about computers, essentially a memory could be thought of as a set of a network of computers that when that network is activated, it outputs a certain thing, and that certain thing is a memory. I guess you could think of it that way as well. So hopefully this example is a little clear for you as you're thinking about this. All right, so these memories with that network isn't in just one specific part of your brain. So your memory of your first kiss isn't like sitting over here in your brain or sitting over here. Your memory of the first time you saw it, well, you probably don't remember the first time you saw a rainbow, but maybe you went outside yesterday after it rained a little bit and saw a rainbow. That memory is not like over here. It's in a whole set of networked neurons all over your brain. All right, so these are some structures that are really important for different aspects of memory. So the frontal lobes are where a lot of our episodic memories are stored. A lot of those networks are there in the frontal lobes. The amygdala is really active when we're feeling an emotion. So if you felt nervous or excited or both when you were having your first kiss, the amygdala was probably active, and the amygdala is part of a lot of memories. So the amygdala is part of the network in many, many memories. That the temporal lobes are very helpful for explicit memory, as well as priming new memories or priming memories to come up from your long-term memory. So hippocampus as well for priming memories, the cerebellum for implicit memories, like how to do things like move a spoon, things like that. All right, so let's talk about then retrieving those memories. And this is really relevant also to the memory tips that we'll go into at the end of the lecture. But the serial position effect is our tendency, just naturally, to remember the things at the beginning or the end of an event more easily than things in the middle. So today we've had class for a couple hours at this point. So the things that we heard at the beginning, like at the beginning, I mentioned the exam is going to be opening up after class. So hopefully you remember that. And then the things that happened right before break, my computer being weird, are probably more heightened in your mind because of this primacy and recency effect. You can use that to your advantage as well. So if you take breaks during studying, you will tend to remember those things that you study right at the beginning after your break and right at the end right before your break. So if you study in smaller chunks rather than, say, trying to read the whole chapter at once, you'll tend to remember a little bit more, a little bit better. So some other things that we do for retrieval is recall. And the video talked about this a little bit, but this is essentially retrieving previously learned info, recalling it cold, you could say. So for an essay exam, it's really focusing on that recall. Tell me everything you know about how neurons work. If that was my question, you have to recall a lot. You have to try and pull that information that you previously learned up. So that's recall. Recognition is kind of identifying or recognizing. So it still ties your working memory into your long-term memory, but now this is like a multiple choice test. So I say, which of these is involved with memory? The amygdala, well, that's probably a bad question because really so much of your brain is involved with memories. But asking something like any multiple choice question, if you can recognize one of those answers, that's what it's talking about here. I just can't come up with a good multiple choice question on the spot. That's why I take time to make the tests and make them good, because it's actually hard to do good questions. So that's recall, completely remembering or recalling previously learned information. Recognition is like, oh, I recognize that person's face. I recognize that car. I recognize answer B is the correct answer here. Information presented at the time of encoding, that is like in the same kind of context, is helpful as well. So right now, you probably are learning on your computer or tablet or phone, whatever it is, and people tend to be habitual, so you're probably doing this at the same place. Maybe it's your desk. A couple examples today talked about being at their desk. So you learned this material at your desk. You will tend to do better on an exam doing the exam at your desk than you would if you went to, say, a library to have a little more quiet, because that's a new location. So you encoded that information in a specific location. Part of the context you're in, your environment, your desk, your own computer, is probably tied a little bit in that neural network to that memory. So it makes it just that little bit easier cognitively to remember things in the same location. So if we're ever back in in-person classes again, well, that was very hopeful, wasn't it? The next time we're in in-person classes, some of you might even be taking in-person classes right now, taking an exam in the same seat you're sitting in during the class will tend to lead to better outcomes. So you'll do better because you encoded things, because you were in class, you were looking at the board or you were looking at the screen from that specific angle. So in your mind, or when you're trying to remember the answer to a problem, you can more easily remember the slideshow in this specific context. So that's encoding specificity. You also, because of encoding specificity, might not recognize something or might not have that recognition in a new context. So for school-wise, you might not be able to remember some information that you learned when you're in a totally different context. As a kid, you might not recognize your elementary school teacher when you see them in the store. So walking down the aisle, also since my daughter, she's 7, she was thinking that the teachers, and I thought this as a kid too, that the teachers lived at the school. So it's not in their understanding of the context to think of their teacher living at a home or going to the store. They just, in their mind, they exist there at the school. In your mind, maybe I just exist here in your computer screen or your phone screen. Yeah. So autobiographical memories, these are, you can think just autobiographical. So an autobiography is a recollection or a report or a book of your experiences. That's what an autobiographical memory is. It's episodic memories of your first kiss, you learning to drive, the things you might put in an autobiography. With that, we remember our second and third decades of life best. So we kind of answered the first part of this question of why. But why might we remember decades 2 and 3 the best of our entire life? So either raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Why do you think we remember our second and third decades of life better than any other time of our life, even when you're asking people to recall autobiographical memories at 80? Those memories are from like 10 to 30, basically. All right, we've got a couple hands and a couple responses. So Adam says the good old days, and yeah, and for a lot of people, they do see those as the good old days, and that's where a lot of their memories are from. So let's go. It's probably just because it's alphabetical, but I see Kelly's hand up here at the top, and then Jonathan. So go for it, Kelly.
Oh, here we go. So during like the second decade of our lives, it's our experiences coming from like high school, middle school. That's when we're trying to be ourselves and try to prove who we are to ourselves. So that's where like most of our events come from. It's just like you're trying new things, you're doing new things, you're learning more about yourself, and that's what you remember the most. It's like who you are.
Yeah, very good. So you're developing your identity at that time, a lot of new experiences. People do tend to remember novel things, so a lot of things are happening there. Like you said, graduating middle school, graduating high school, graduating college, starting jobs, and then with your identity, that's a lot of what you tie future memories to. So really great example. Jonathan, your hand's down now, but did you want to make any other comments? Actually, it looks like Jonathan. Oh, there he is.
So I was just gonna say the same thing pretty much, but yeah, generally it's just where a lot of your firsts happen, like first house, first whatever, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, perfect. And that's exactly right. We remember those decades of our life because of those firsts, those new experiences, those new events, our identity. Again, most people figure out their identity first in between about the ages of 14 and 24. It can change later in life. We talked about that during our week on development. But that's a lot of what you then tie future memories to. So these are being repeated for many, many times versus maybe between your fourth decade of life. Maybe there you're working and you're going through maybe a more normal pattern. You're not moving as much. Maybe you're in the same career that entire 10 years. So there's not as many new events or experiences during that time. So very good. With this also, we don't remember the first decade of life very well because our memory is still being built. So for younger children, they're still learning the process. Their brain is literally learning how to make memories, and there's not as many things to connect it to meaningfully. So up until late childhood, That's when the long-term memory is a lot better and our working memory is starting to work really well, more similar to how it would as an adult. So that's some of the reasons we don't have very early memories on average. With that, autobiographical memory, so our memory of learning to drive or our first kiss or whatever it is, can include both reality, so what really happened, as well as myth or things that have been added to that over time that weren't actually part of that original memory. So with that, another interesting memory feature is a flashbulb memory. So the example here is 9/11. It's some kind of emotionally significant event, and we usually tend to remember these with more accuracy and more vividness. So for anyone who was alive at the time of 9/11 and heard about it, you probably have a pretty good memory of, on that day, what were you experiencing when you heard about 9/11. I'll probably have to update this soon with students and myself all getting older. So, well, actually, all you students tend to stay the same age, and I get older. As the students, I'll stay the same age. So I'll probably have to update this. But does anyone have a flashbulb memory of 9/11, where they were, who they were with, what time of day it was? So Karina says, I was in school in a portable during 4th grade. All right. I'm curious, Karina, do you remember, maybe not specifically like the words on posters, but do you remember the classroom there better than, say, your 5th grade classroom? Yeah, so Karina answered in the affirmative. She does remember that 4th grade classroom better than other classrooms like 5th grade. And so this, don't remember anything about your 5th grade classroom. Yeah, that's a really good example of how this kind of flashbulb memory can be really powerful. You've got a lot more accuracy, a lot more vividness about that 4th grade classroom, but not your 5th. For myself, my 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade classroom are kind of all melded into one. All my teachers from 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, I mean, this would probably make them sad, are kind of melded into one person in my mind. And I also can't remember most of their names, but I've always been bad with names. With that, though, flashbulb memories don't just have to be that kind of event. It can be any emotionally significant event. So a car crash, a car accident, could give you a flashbulb memory. I was rear-ended 4 years ago now. And I can remember that day of driving, like that driving experience where I was going to and from, a lot better than I can remember driving the day before that or the day after that. So this is also relevant to things like traumatic memories and trauma that you might have. So it's interesting that humans can create these kind of flashbulb memories. I think of it similarly to what we talked about with the taste aversions. So we can experience one thing, but remember it so vividly because of the emotional significance, basically amping up that production of neurotransmitters and reinforcing those connections between the neurons for these things. And it seems adaptive. It helps us to, say, avoid trauma or remember trauma at times so that we can then avoid it, hopefully. Even now, oftentimes, me getting rear-ended happened when I was at a stoplight. Luckily, I was in a car and not my motorcycle, or I probably wouldn't be here. But even now, like stopping at a stoplight, I still get that extra fear than I had before, and like am checking my rear view mirror more often to watch for people not stopping for the stoplight. Yeah. So with that, similarly, traumatic events, we can create really vivid memories about traumatic events. Oh, the Boston bombing. That's another good one, and a lot more recent for students. So that's actually a pretty good example that I could use for future classes. So thank you, Jonathan. That's a really good suggestion. That could definitely cause flashbulb memories for some. Write that down. Yeah, I definitely for any of your flashbulb memories, try to think of the day before or the day after in that same kind of area, like were you in a classroom or your home. See if you can remember what was happening, and you probably can't because you have that vivid memory of that time. Flashbulb memories tend to be pretty time contained, so a couple hours to an entire day that flashbulb memory kind of encapsulates. So we do the same kind of thing for traumatic events. We can have a really vivid memory and include a lot more details for something that's traumatic. And this is, again, something adaptive. So evolutionarily, we've learned that to learn from trauma pretty quickly and have more vivid memories, so we can hopefully avoid that. So the stress, specifically, what's happening at the neural level, a little bit what's happening at the neural level, is the stress is helping the amygdala, which is heavily involved in emotions, and the hippocampus, which is really heavily involved in like priming memories around your brain, create these really vivid memories. So the more emotionally significant is going to be a lot clearer memory. So with that, studies find that 5+ years after these memories, even though we might have more vivid memories of these events, we still, even for these memories that are written so vividly, we can have a lot of errors or distortions to that memory, even just a short time, or you might consider 5 years a long time, after that event. So how would that apply to, say, a court case? If the court case is happening and people are going up on the stand, let's say 5 years after some kind of traumatic event, if your memory at that point might have errors or distortions. So I don't see any comments coming in. So maybe we're just thinking about it, or maybe it's a long enough explanation that you're still typing it. That's fine too. But essentially, when you have a court case, you're trying to recall what happened. Memories can be a little different. They're not a perfect inside-out memory ball like videotape that you can watch. Since they're part of networks, since a memory is part of a neural network of 1,000 neurons, you can add new neurons to that network later on. You can take away some. You can alter how it's seen. So let's say, for example, you have, say, some memories of you and your high school best friend. So let's say you've got all these positive memories, but then a couple of years later, you and your high school best friend have a really bad falling out. And so you look at those memories now and you're a little sad when you think about them. Like, you can remember that you were happy, but while you're thinking about them, you're sad. That sadness, that bit of the neural network that you're feeling sad at the moment, can actually alter those original memories so that when you remember them in the future, now they're a little bit sad. There's like that tinge of sadness to those memories, which is actually really similar to what happens in the movie Inside Out with the emotion sadness, like touching that memory. She's now added a new neural connection there to the emotion of sadness. So in some ways, it's kind of interesting how accurate in some ways that movie is to describe it like at a children's level in an entertaining way, but that's beside the point. Kelly does say the memories after the event might become unreliable or warped. So that one example is just the emotions might change. Like, as you look at those memories, those emotions might change. What if you are, let's say, at your high school reunion and you're reminiscing about something, the time that you and your team, or you and your club, or you and your band, or whatever it was, won the state championship. Let's say in your memory, you remember that your best friend, Jane, was not there. They were sick that day, so they weren't there. But your other friends, they absolutely insist that Jane was there during that event. You might actually, the next time you remember that, they might essentially have convinced you that Jane was there. And the next time you remember, you might actually remember that Jane was there. So that part of the memory is changed or altered. So with that being said, how much can memories get distorted or changed? I mean, I guess it depends on how you look at it, but not as much as you might expect, but they can change and get altered. So this is especially relevant when we're talking about things like repressed memories, as well as talking to children about cases that they might be involved in, especially with things like sexual abuse that they might be in a courtroom setting for and trying to remember. So repressed memories are definitely a thing. We talked about how some of Freud's defense mechanisms are still relevant today. Repression is one. We talked about how trauma can lead to more vivid memories, but we can repress those. We can motivate ourselves. We can choose to forget, or basically it's a painful enough memory that we intentionally forget these things. And so that is definitely possible. Repressed memories can be remembered, but they're generally not just by on your own. So with that, our accuracy does improve throughout childhood. So our memory's accuracy, we have more things to tie it to, more things to make it meaningful for, but that does mean that children are more susceptible than adults to misleading or incorrect information, or having their memories kind of tweaked or changed a little bit. So when you prompt for events, in the case of like a courtroom setting for a child who's in a case, it could lead to actually distorting their memories of the event. So this is a bunch of good resources. If you ever have to ask questions about children that you think might have been abused, these are some really good. There's a lot more information in all these links. So follow that advice. I've got a couple of the bullet points like condensed down that we'll talk about though. So asking open-ended questions that aren't leading them in any specific way is one of the best ways to get at a more accurate picture of what happened. So asking about like who, what, when, and where. So how did it happen? What happened? Who was there? How does it make you feel? Those are open-ended questions that you're not suggesting anything did or did not happen. You're not suggesting anyone was or was not there, or did any or did not do anything. So that's a better way to get a little more accurate information. Here are a couple other examples of open-ended question. How does the other person react, or how did the other person react when you said this or you did this? Tell me about your relationship with this person. How do you see your future with this person? Questions that wouldn't be good are leading questions. So was blank what happened? Did blank happen? Isn't it true that blah, 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 blah? Would you agree that blah, 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 blah? So essentially any kind of declarative sentence or statement followed by is that right? Is that correct? That has a lot higher probability to change or alter memories. Yeah, so definitely Karina brings up a good point. So asking what they saw and bringing their memories back to that situation can help them remember, but that can be rough. Absolutely true. So, I mean, this is definitely a sensitive topic. You don't want to be traumatizing anybody, but let's say in the setting of like a court, or if you're a lawyer in the future or a detective, these are the kinds of questions, the open-ended ones, would be ones that you might have to ask in those kinds of situations, or if it's your nephew or something and you're worried about, or your own child as well. So again, these websites have a lot more information, and those bullet points were there. So hopefully you never have to worry about this at all, but hopefully if you do, you remember this conversation, you can come back, go to those links. Hopefully they still exist at that point. If not, you've got the little bullet points. So let's talk about false memories entirely, memories that are entirely not true. So there's some really good research by Kathy Pezdek. So she's actually a researcher at CGU. She taught me like half of the stats I know basically. So, and she does a lot of research on cognitive things and memory specifically, and cognitive aspects of learning. But she's done a lot of research as well on false memories. So you can read this whole abstract and read this whole article and also go look up her other articles. But the takeaway that she's found in her years of research is that false memories are unlikely for implausible events. So completely false memories, things that never actually happened. it's really hard to create a completely false memory for something that is not likely to have happened. It's a lot easier to create a false memory for something that's similar to things people have already experienced. So in this study, they tried to implant false memories. One was like a more implausible false memory, and another was so one was kind of plausible, one was very implausible. So the memories were, one, getting lost in a shopping mall. So that was the little more plausible one. None of these children, and they were 5 to 7-year-old children and also 9 to 12-year-old children. They were essentially reading a description that they were told, like their parent had written, about the time they got lost in the mall, or the more implausible event was when they received a rectal enema. And you might be able to see how this is also connected to, say, research on what kind of false memories can you implant that might be relevant in, say, a sexual abuse case. So a lot of the children didn't remember either false event, so 54%. So some of them remembered the implausible event, but not very many at all. The most likely one to remember was the sort of plausible event, the one where they were lost in a shopping mall. So these kids, at some time in their life, they might have gotten lost. They checked with like the parents. They were never lost in a shopping mall, but maybe they were lost somewhere else, or they've also been to shopping malls. So that's a pretty easy scenario to imagine. So I remember in my own childhood, well, hopefully I remember in my own childhood, like hiding in the clothing racks that are like circles, like hiding in the middle of those. And my mom was afraid because she couldn't find me. And I just thought it was hilarious, and was laughing there. And she was terrified because she thought she'd lost me, and I was hiding. So that is a memory I have. Maybe some of these kids have that, and they kind of could apply that plausible event to actual memories. They can connect it to something in an already available neural network. So it is pretty easy to remember a false memory about something plausible, something that could have happened. It's very unlikely for these kids to remember that rectal enema because they had no context for it. They had never experienced something like that before, so it was hard for them to create that memory. So kind of the bottom line here is, if a child has a memory of an event, something similar to that probably did happen. Whether or not that exact specific event did happen, something very similar to what they're stating or saying probably did happen. It's very unlikely to have a false memory of something completely implausible. So hopefully that was clear. It's easy to make a memory of getting lost in a shopping mall. Hard to make a memory of having a rectal enema, because one is a lot more plausible in daily lived experience, easier to connect to a neural network. So Karina shared something with the class. So thank you definitely very much for sharing that. I'm wondering if I should even read it and then record it and upload it to YouTube. I don't think I will read it on camera. And the chat doesn't get recorded in YouTube. But anyway, about false memories. Yeah, thank you for that. Essentially, different contexts were kind of making Karina not remember things accurately from early years of life, and it wasn't till new context or new information clarified those memories that Karina might have believed that those original memories didn't actually happen. So, so thank you for sharing that, Karina. And yeah, this is exactly how memory can work. So I'm sorry you experienced that as well. That is really awful. Yeah, I wish there was more to say there, but yeah, I am sorry. So let's move closer to the memory tips to help you in studying and life as well. So Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is essentially how quickly we forget information. So today we've covered the whole chapter essentially now of chapter 6. So I've delivered 100% of the information. About 20 minutes after I've delivered it, you tend to forget almost half. So what's that, 42%? So you forget about 42% only as much as, or only as little as 20 minutes later. If you look at this, it's got 1 hour, 9 hours a day, 2 days. So with that, this forgetting curve is about how quickly we forget material. So at about 6 days, well, one positive and one negative, is about 6 days later, we only remember about 25% of the material we learned that 6 days before. Positive about that is that 25%, almost all of that will be retained in our long-term memory. So if you remember something 6 days later, it's probably going to stick with you for the foreseeable future. So one thing that you can do is study, review. So hopefully with reading the chapter, that would be an example of getting 100% of the information. And a day after that, you're only remembering about 50%. So then you come to class the day later and you get that information again. Then you'll remember more of it for longer. See, it's making this curve a little less steep. And then maybe you review your notes and then you write a note card before the exam. And if you've done that, that makes this curve a lot less steep of a slope. And hopefully then you'll remember closer to 100% forever. So that's what we learned about how quickly we forget. So it's a little unfortunate that we forget so much so quickly, but if we review things, we kind of reset that curve and the slope is less bad each time we review that information. Amnesia is a aspect of forgetting. Anterograde is the inability to store new information and events. Retrograde is the inability to retrieve past information and events. So with that, what was his name? Kyle, in the video, the musician in the video we watched, Kyle had retrograde amnesia, could not call back past information and events from a while back in his life. Or was it that he wasn't storing new information? I may have just mixed that up. Sorry about that. So with these memory skills, limitations as well that we have in our memory and our working memory specifically, there are tips that we know from cognitive study to improve specifically your study, but this can apply to other things too. So remembering things to do for your job or how to do processes and how to do the programming in the correct order, things like that. So arranging things into memorable structures. So whether it's a mnemonic like the loci method, something like that. Experimenting with different techniques. So remembering things in hierarchies. This is how I remember different types of validity. There's like big umbrellas of validity, and then there's things that fall under those categories. So hierarchies for that. Networks. So how do we remember things? Well, maybe math is connected to shapes and geometry, which is connected to art. So you can remember networks of things that are similar to one another. And then analogies to other familiar things. So processing deeply and attending to things. And we talked about a lot of examples of deep processing at the beginning of class. Make associations. So associated or connected to your own life, connected to a friend's life. The examples that we get of people's flashbulb memories or memory problems or memory strengths, these are exactly what we need to do to process deeply and make good associations. We used imagery in class, so use chunking as well. So put information into chunks. You can put it into associated chunks. So you can add these together. So you can attend to something, process it deeply by making associations and chunking all the information we know now about neurology and memory, put that together, and you'll be able to remember more of it better. Then review it tomorrow, and you'll remember it even better. Encode early and often. So with that, taking breaks is very helpful to help you encode that. So, and then rehearse. So redo your notes. So if you write really detailed notes, I know some peers that write almost everything that is said in a lecture down. I just don't write fast enough to do that. But one good thing that they can do is redo their notes in a lot briefer summary that focuses and ties it into their lives and things. Talk to others about the material. So this is what's really good about having things like discussion groups. You can make these yourself for any of your classes. It helped me a lot in graduate school, is to actually work with other people in the same class to review material. You could do that as well in any of your classes, especially online where it's so easy to see who's in class, who's participating. You could ask those people, hey, do you want to get together and study for an hour before the exam? And you could all go over the study guide. Test yourself. So trying to test yourself with essay questions is the best way to do it. So on my study guides, sometimes I give open-ended questions. It's not exactly an essay question, but similar. Rest and eat well before you do something like an exam or a hard test or something. Take breaks during the study process. So get that primacy and recency effect to work for you. For people on average, so just neurotypical people, the recommended time for a study session or a work session and then taking a break is in between 20 and 40 minutes. So depending on the intensity of the task, what it is you're doing, you might want to do more closer to 20 minutes, you might want to do closer to 40 minutes, and just test it out, figure out what works best for you. For me, I've mentioned before, I'm neurodivergent and have ADHD, so closer to the 20 minutes or sometimes even 15 to pretty much my max is about like 35 minutes for that attention for a study or work session. If you go back with that in mind and like watch some of the previous lectures, when I'm doing a lot of talking for that whole 35 minutes, you can see me make a lot more mistakes and get like drawn off onto tangents, kind of like this one actually. Now this is a relevant tangent. So for me, I've learned that about that 20-minute mark is when I should take a break. So if I'm reading a research article, I might take a break at 20 minutes, or if I'm reading a chapter in a textbook, I'll take a break at that 20 minutes. When you go that 20 minutes versus 40 minutes, take a shorter break. So if you're studying 20 minutes, maybe take a 3 to 5 minute break. If you're studying a whole 40 minutes, you might take closer to a 10, maybe even 12-minute break if you've gone and worked that whole 40 minutes. So another big thing with that is to leave what you're doing and do something completely different. So sometimes on my breaks when I'm reading or grading or doing work or writing, I'll stay sitting here at my desk and watch a YouTube video. That's a bad way to take a break. A better way is when I get up, walk away, get a drink of water, come back. So get up, walk away, change my kid's diaper, and then come back. Doing something completely different really helps your brain have that primacy and recency effect. Additionally, if you have multiple classes to study for, a good thing could be, let's say you have a psychology class, a math class, and a sociology class. Psychology and sociology, they're pretty similar in a lot of things. A lot of the topics you'll be talking about are the same. A lot of the theories might be the same. So if we're talking about psychology, sociology, and math, you've got all those three classes. What you would want to do is maybe study psychology for that 40-minute chunk. Get up, take a break, walk away, do your dishes, something like that. Come back and then work on math. Work on a completely different topic. Do that for 40 minutes, and then after that 40 minutes break, go to sociology or psychology. But it wouldn't be good, or it wouldn't be as beneficial for you memory-wise to do the psychology for 40 minutes, take that 10-minute break, then come back and do sociology. Some of that in your memory is going to start to get networked together, and you might get confused like when coming up against questions on an exam. So taking breaks is a really big one, shows a lot of good effects. Using retrieval cues, like the context about things, is really good too. Keeping comfortable and calm during an exam specifically, or during a study session. Yeah, so this is a really good video that focuses on memory tips specifically, but also reviews a lot of the things that we've talked about today on memory. But I think that's the end of chapter 6 specifically. The content. Just as a reminder, when we come back from the break, again, your exam will be, oh, I closed that because I didn't want it to be in the RAM of the computer and slowing things down. I'll open the schedule back up really quick. So your exam opens at 6 tonight, so about an hour from now. Feel free to take it then if you feel ready, or it closes Sunday just before midnight. So you could wait till then. Where did the syllabus go? There you are. All right. So again, exam opens in about an hour. Exam 3 is open this entire weekend. You don't have to take it on the break. Like, that's break time. If you want to, go for it. But that's why I also have it open on Saturday and Sunday. So it closes Sunday at just before midnight. And we do have a little more time left in our class period right now. So with that, let's open it up for questions about what we've covered, as well as I think this would be a good time to go over some of the study guide. So with that, I'll stop the recording at this point, and feel free to ask questions, and then we'll go over the study guide. So the class portion is done, but definitely stick around if you want to go over the study guide at all.